Hey guys, tonight's journey takes us somewhere ancient, somewhere quiet, a place where the wind drifts over sand and stone, and where a simple stream of water once meant life, beauty, and eternity. Tonight you and I are traveling to the Persian plateau, to the time of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, and in a way the designer of paradise itself. If you close your eyes you might see it. A vast plain in the heart of ancient Persia, near the city of Pasargadae. The air is dry, the horizon pale with dust, and the mountains rise like soft gray ghosts in the distance. Yet in the middle of this desolation there is something strange. A rectangle carved into the earth. 4 long channels meet at its center, each lined with baked brick and polished stone. Water glimmers faintly along the channels, drawn from some distant spring through a complex network of underground tunnels called qanats. This place, the first Persian royal garden, was built more than 2,500 years ago, under Cyrus's direct command. It wasn't just a pleasant place for rest. To the Persians, this was a statement of order, an earthly echo of something eternal. They called it a paradisa, meaning an enclosed garden, or in later languages, paradise. The Persians didn't invent the idea of walled gardens. The Babylonians had their hanging terraces, the Egyptians had their lotus ponds, but the Persians took this old idea and gave it mathematical precision, a symmetry that felt sacred. The gardens were divided into 4 equal quarters representing the 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Each stream represented a river of paradise described later in Zoroastrian and even biblical traditions. And at the center, and where the waters met, stood the king's pavilion. Imagine it, a cool marble platform surrounded by pomegranate trees, wild roses, and the scent of cypress resin carried by the wind. The garden wasn't large, but it felt infinite, a deliberate illusion of eternity inside an enclosure of order. Cyrus's empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, yet this small plot of land at Pasargadae became his most personal project. Archaeologists still debate whether he designed it himself, or whether it was the work of Median engineers or Babylonian architects. But one thing is certain. It was built not just to please the eye, but to symbolize control over chaos. The Persian plateau was harsh, sunburnt, stony, and dry. Every blade of grass was a victory against the desert. To create a garden here was to declare mastery over nature. Water had to be coaxed from underground channels that sometimes stretched for miles. The people who dug these tunnels, the Mogani, or water whisperers, worked in silence and near darkness, following the faint slope of the land, listening for the subtle murmur of underground springs. Without them, no garden could exist. Without their invisible labor, Cyrus's paradise would have remained just a dream. There is something both humble and grand about the Persian garden. It's easy to imagine it as a lush oasis, but early records describe something more restrained. Orderly rows of cypress and pine, gravel paths, and small pools reflecting the sky. The beauty wasn't in abundance, but in balance. Every shadow, every ripple, every line of sight was calculated to create calm. Even the smallest detail, a stone bench, a carved channel, a bed of tulips, was placed according to a philosophy. That harmony itself was divine. And perhaps that's why these gardens endured. Long after the empire fell, the idea of the paradisa spread through the world, to Greece, to Rome, and centuries later into the Islamic world, where it became the Shaharbagh, the fourfold garden of heaven. When you walk through the courtyards of Isfahan, or the terraces of Mughal India, or even the walled gardens of Andalusia, you're walking through echoes of Cyrus's dream. But Cyrus's garden was more than beauty. It was political. It showed his subjects that he could command not only armies but the earth itself. It was said that he often walked there at dawn, speaking softly to his generals and advisors among the trees. Perhaps he found comfort there, surrounded by the steady rhythm of flowing water. A man who ruled half the known world, pausing to listen to the trickle of a stream. It's possible that in those quiet mornings, he imagined something greater, that paradise wasn't just a reward after death, but something humans could build carefully, one channel and one tree at a time. When Cyrus died, he was buried nearby, in a simple stone tomb surrounded by the same plain he once transformed. His garden didn't survive the centuries. When the water dried, the channels filled with dust. But the idea endured. Even now, under the desert sun, you can still see the faint outlines of those 4 long channels, leading to a center that no longer exists. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. The garden was meant to mirror eternity, yet it too vanished into sand. Was paradise ever real, or was it always an act of imagination? A fleeting geometry of water and dust built only to disappear. If you stand on the old plain of Pasargadae today, it's hard to imagine that this was once a paradise. The soil crunches underfoot, pale and dry, and the only sound is the sigh of wind brushing against rock. But under your feet, long ago, the earth itself breathed. Invisible rivers once ran below this land, carrying life through tunnels carved by hand, through the sweat and patience of unseen men. They were called qanats, and they were one of humanity's quietest revolutions. If Cyrus's garden was the dream, then these channels were the veins that made it live. The qanat system was deceptively simple. A mother well dug deep into an underground aquifer, followed by a long, sloping tunnel that carried the water by gravity to where it was needed. But to dig a qanat required geometry, astronomy, and faith. A small miscalculation, a few inches of slope too shallow or too steep, and the entire system would fail. The men who dug them worked in near darkness. They would enter narrow shafts with nothing but oil lamps and a small draft of air from the surface. Each step, each tap of the pick was guided by a kind of listening, a sensitivity to the murmur of underground moisture. They dug through sandstone, gravel, and clay, their only measure of progress the faint cooling of the air and the whisper of water far below. Archaeologists estimate that by the height of the Achaemenid Empire, thousands of miles of qanats ran beneath the Persian plateau, the oldest sustainable water network in the world, still used in parts of Iran today. Every drop that flowed into the royal gardens of Pasargadae came from this hidden world, carved by men whose names were never recorded. It is an odd thing, isn't it? How empires are remembered for their kings and generals, yet built by people who lived and died unseen. In Persian chronicles, the workers of the qanats are barely mentioned, though their craft outlasted the empire itself. Their tunnels were self-sustaining, maintained for generations by families who passed down the knowledge like sacred scripture. They lived quiet lives, digging in the earth by day, sleeping in clay huts by night, their ears trained for the faintest sound of running water, a whisper of survival in the desert. When the Greeks came centuries later, they were astonished. How could a civilization so dry, so barren, feed cities and orchards without rivers? They wrote that the Persians made water where there was none. But the Persians would have smiled at that. To them, water was never made. It was found, nurtured, and guided like a shy animal coaxed into the light. From the high terraces of Pasargadae, Cyrus could look out and see a pattern that mirrored his empire. Invisible order beneath apparent chaos. The qanats were his empire's secret geometry, the same geometry reflected in his gardens, in the fourfold symmetry of paradise. He governed as he gardened, by channels, divisions, and flow, everything connected yet enclosed. Water moved from mountain to city, from city to garden, from garden to field. Every household had its share, measured by a small, precise device called a water clock, which dripped according to time and right. Even the poorest farmer could trace the trickle of his life to the same mother well that fed the king's roses. That balance was fragile, yet for centuries it held. When Cyrus's successors expanded the empire, they brought the art of the Khanate to every corner, from the dry plains of Syria to the mountains of Armenia, and even to the edges of Egypt. Each new garden was a promise. Wherever Persian order reached, life would follow. But water is a restless thing. It flows only when tended, and it rebels when neglected. When dynasties shifted, when canals broke and wells silted up, the land remembered its thirst. Entire villages disappeared under dust when the Khanates collapsed. For every garden that bloomed, another withered unseen. Even in Cyrus's own lifetime, maintenance was constant. Teams of laborers traveled across the empire, clearing debris, remeasuring slopes, repairing the fragile veins beneath the soil. They carried bronze tools, reed lamps, and a belief that their work was sacred, an act of worship through patience. Because to the Persians, the struggle to make the desert bloom was not just survival. It was spiritual. Zoroastrianism, the faith that guided much of early Persian thought, saw water as a holy element, one of the pure creations of Ahura Mazda. To pollute a stream was a sin. To guide one with wisdom was a virtue. So every Khanate, every garden, every droplet reflected that cosmic order, the eternal fight between the clean and the corrupt, between creation and decay. As dusk fell over Pasargadae, the last rays of sun would catch on the garden's central pool. The water shimmered gold, then silver, then black as the air cooled. You might imagine Cyrus standing there, watching the reflection of the sky ripple on the surface, a mirror of both heaven and empire. Perhaps he understood, as few rulers did, that control was temporary, but balance could last. And maybe that's why his garden mattered more than his conquests. The walls of Babylon would crumble, but the idea of the garden, of paradise as human-made peace, and would live on. From the Khanates of Persia to the courtyards of Andalusia, from the fountains of Mughal India to the silent marble pools of Isfahan, the pattern repeated itself, quiet, symmetrical, eternal. Still, one can't help but wonder, when the last drops of those ancient Khanates finally run dry, when silence returns fully to the desert, what will remain of paradise except the memory of water? The years drifted quietly across the Persian plateau, the way sand moves across stone, slow, steady, almost unnoticeable until everything has changed. Cyrus the Great was gone. His tomb stood alone not far from his garden, a simple rectangular structure built from 6 wide stone steps, rising toward a small chamber at the top. The people of his empire came to visit that place for generations, leaving flowers, lamps, and offerings of water. Even Alexander the Great, when he arrived centuries later as a conqueror, is said to have wept there. He ordered the tomb to be repaired and guarded, and for a brief moment the conqueror bowed to the conquered, the Greek to the Persian. Perhaps Alexander understood something profound. Cyrus's legacy wasn't the battles he won or the gold he amassed. It was the order he brought to chaos. And nothing symbolized that better than the garden he built in the heart of a desert. By the time of Darius the Great, Pasargadae had become more of a memory than a capital. The court moved to Persepolis, where the idea of paradise grew even larger. Stone terraces, ceremonial halls, and gardens irrigated by complex canals. The paradisa evolved from a private enclosure into a symbol of kingship itself, but the essence remained the same. The king stood at the center, surrounded by balance and beauty, the human in harmony with the divine. Every visiting envoy who stepped into those gardens would feel it immediately. The sudden coolness of the air, the smell of cypress, the distant murmur of water. It was a sensory declaration that Persia was not a realm of conquest but of cultivation. In many ways, the garden was a mirror of Persian philosophy. To rule was to maintain balance, not domination. To build was to tame the forces of the world, gently, patiently, through design and understanding. And yet even the best order cannot resist time. Centuries passed. The Achaemenids fell. The Seleucids came, then the Parthians, then the Sassanids, and finally the empires of Islam. The original garden of Pasargadae slowly vanished beneath dust and wind. But its idea, its geometry, its philosophy, traveled quietly across ages and lands. When Islam spread across Persia, the old Paradisa found new meaning. The Quran described paradise as a garden beneath which rivers flow, a place of peace and shade and cool water. It was a vision that resonated deeply with the Persian soul, already shaped by centuries of desert and drought. And so, the ancient form lived on, and now called the Shahar Bagh, the fourfold garden. In cities like Shiraz, Kerman, and Isfahan, new gardens appeared, rectangles of order amidst chaos, water channels glinting in sunlight. Their designs traced invisible lines back to Cyrus's time. Even the word paradise, when it reached Greek as paradisos and then Latin and finally English, carried within it the Persian root, paradiesa, an enclosed garden. The memory of a king's geometry had become humanity's dream of heaven. The Persian garden became a bridge between worlds. In Andalusia, the Muslim architects of Al-Andalus shaped the Alhambra's courtyards from the same blueprint: symmetrical channels, fountains, and cypress trees. In India, centuries later, the Mughals perfected the form, turning it into something vast and majestic. The Taj Mahal, that silent marble tomb of love, is itself a Chaharbagh, a Persian garden of paradise turned to stone. Its four waterways, lined with black marble, divide the complex into perfect quadrants, meeting at a central pool where the reflection of heaven and earth mingle. Every step of that design echoes the first garden of Cyrus, and still, through all this, the meaning remained gentle and human. A desire to bring balance, shade, and water into a world of heat and chaos. To make a small piece of earth resemble the perfection we imagine above us. Today, if you walk through what remains of Pasargadae, you'll see the faint outlines of the old garden, little more than furrows in the dust. But sometimes after rare rains, water seeps again into the ancient channels. For a few days the earth remembers. The air grows cool. Small wildflowers bloom in the cracks of the stone. It's easy to miss, easy to think that nothing remains. But the silence there is full of what once was and what it taught. You might sit near Cyrus's tomb and listen. The wind hums across the plain. The horizon is endless, and you realize that the dream of paradise was never about perfection. It was about persistence, about people who refused to surrender to the desert. They built channels in darkness, carried water across impossible distances, planted trees knowing they might never see them grow. They shaped the idea of heaven out of dust and mathematics. Cyrus's garden was small, but it was also infinite, because once the shape of paradise is imagined, it can never fully disappear. It exists wherever someone tends the earth with care, wherever symmetry meets patience, wherever a drop of water becomes a mirror for the sky. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of those ancient gardeners. Think of the sound of water beneath the ground, the scent of cypress under a hot Persian sun. Somewhere beneath the noise of the modern world, that garden still flows. And maybe, just maybe, paradise has always been less a place than a pattern, a quiet geometry of care, waiting to be found again. In the heart of Iran, surrounded by mountains and sand, lies the ancient city of Yazd, a place so dry that even clouds hesitate to pass. The soil here is the color of clay pots, the air thin and hot, and the horizon flickers with mirages. Yet beneath the silence of the desert, an invisible miracle continues, the same one that sustained Cyrus's garden more than 2,000 years ago. Water still flows here, underground through an ancient web of tunnels and shafts, the qanats. They run for miles, connecting the heart of the desert to faraway springs in the mountains. The people who tend them call themselves Mokanis, the water whisperers. For the Mokanis, the desert is alive. They believe the ground hums faintly if you listen carefully enough. That hum tells them where to dig, where the water hides, and where the old tunnels have collapsed. It's not a science they learn from books, but from their fathers, and their fathers before them, a lineage older than most civilizations. A Mokani begins his apprenticeship as a boy, following his elders into the earth. He learns how to feel the air's coolness change as they descend, how to hold a lantern so the flame tilts just slightly when oxygen grows scarce, how to read the language of stone. Every qanat is a living thing, and like any living thing, it must be kept breathing. Each tunnel can stretch for tens of kilometers, with vertical shafts spaced every 20 or 30 meters to bring up the excavated soil. The slope is gentle, barely noticeable, sometimes only 1 meter of drop for every 1,000 traveled. A perfect balance, too steep and the water rushes too fast and erodes the tunnel. Too flat and the water stagnates. The Mokanis carry simple tools, a pick, a bucket, a small leather pouch of water. Inside the tunnels they work in silence, guided by a faint glimmer of light from above and the echo of dripping water ahead. They dig, listen, rest and dig again, a rhythm as steady as breathing. When they emerge at the surface after hours or even days, their eyes blink at the sunlight, and their skin is coated in clay. There is no applause, no ceremony, no audience, and just the satisfaction of knowing that somewhere, in a nearby village, a well will refill, a tree will drink, a garden will bloom. In Yazd, the entire city was built around this unseen network. From above, it looks like a honeycomb, wind catchers, domes, and towers rising from an ocean of beige clay. But below, another world exists, cool corridors of running water, reservoirs shaped like inverted domes, and tunnels whispering faintly underfoot. The qanats feed everything, the gardens, the baths, the mosques, even the underground ice houses where water is frozen and stored through the summer heat. Without them, Yazd would not exist. The city is not a triumph over nature, but a quiet agreement with it, a truce between thirst and patience. Travelers once called Yazd the city that drinks from the earth. When Marco Polo passed through in the 13th century, he wrote of it with awe. A fine and noble city, full of gardens, and in the midst of a desert where water is brought from 30 miles away. To him, it was almost a miracle, a civilization blooming in defiance of geography. But to the people of Yazd, it was never defiance. It was knowledge, carried like a seed from one generation to the next. In the early mornings before the heat settles in, you can still see old Mokanis walking the edge of the desert, scanning the ground. They know where each mother well lies, where the tunnels breathe, where danger hides. Their tools haven't changed in centuries. They still speak in the old rhythms, calling the earth Madar, mother, the water Ru, spirit, and the qanat itself, the vein of the land. Their work is invisible, but their mark is everywhere. Each fruit orchard, each splash of green in the desert is a trace of their labor. Each breeze that passes through a wind catcher carries the coolness of their buried rivers. But the world has changed. Electric pumps, modern wells, and careless expansion have begun to draw water too fast, draining the underground veins. Some qanats have dried up, others have collapsed. The younger generation no longer sees a future in the tunnels. There is no glory in darkness, still a few remain. Elder Mukanas continue their work in the old way, crawling through narrow shafts to clear blockages, patch walls, and redirect the trickling flow. They know that when the machines fail, when drought returns, as it always does, the desert will still remember the old language. It is said that a good Mokani never dies forgotten. When he passes, his family buries him near the mother well he tended so his spirit can continue guiding the water. And sometimes, after heavy rains, villagers claim they hear faint tapping sounds in the tunnels, as if someone is still at work below, clearing the way. Whether that's superstition or memory doesn't matter much. In Yazd, faith and function have always been the same thing. The qanats are not just engineering, they're belief made visible. The desert of Yazd breathes because people taught it how. It inhales water from the mountains and exhales life through its wells. It is, in its quiet way, still paradise. Not lush, not soft, but enduring. And perhaps the true measure of paradise is not in abundance, but in survival. The slow, steady heartbeat of water beneath the sand. Beneath the narrow streets of Yazd lies a second city, silent, cold, and eternal. It doesn't have walls or domes, but it has corridors of flowing water, chambers of stone, and long sloping tunnels that stretch for miles beneath the dunes. This invisible city is what keeps the real one alive. For every mosque that catches the sun above ground, there is a channel below it, feeding its courtyard fountains. For every wind tower that funnels the breeze into a home, there's a cool basin beneath it, storing the water that softens the desert air. Even the smallest cup of tea poured in a Yazdi home is drawn, ultimately, from the veins that pulse beneath the soil. The qanat system of Yazd was not merely engineering, it was architecture with purpose. The people built not to conquer nature, but to synchronize with it. The tunnels weren't random. They were precisely aligned with the contours of the mountains and the slope of the land. Each drop of water had a destination. A garden, a reservoir, a public bath, or a mosque courtyard. And above the city, the badgirs, the famous Persian wind catchers, worked in harmony with these channels. Hot air from the desert was drawn downward through tall towers, cooled as it passed over the qanat water below, and released gently into the living spaces. No machinery, no electricity, and just geometry, gravity, and wind. It was sustainability before the word existed. In the city's heart lies the Dawlatabad Garden, built in the 18th century but designed on ancient principles. Its long reflecting pool draws from an underground qanat that still flows today. Tall cypress trees rise like green spires against the beige walls, and the central pavilion holds one of the tallest wind catchers in the world. Inside, the air is cool and damp, even when the desert outside burns at 45 degrees. It's easy to walk there and forget that this comfort is not magic. It's math, patience, and inheritance. Every breath of cool air that fills those halls is a whisper of the ancient engineers still guiding the city. For centuries, Yazid's survival depended on strict cooperation. Each family's water share was measured not by ownership but by time. The qanat flow was divided into hours, and each household was entitled to a precise number of minutes per day. The water masters, or mirab, recorded these rights in dusty ledgers and watched over the gates that released the flow. When the time came, a family would open a small channel and direct the water toward their field or courtyard. Neighbors would stand aside in respect. When the allotted time ended, they would close it again, not out of obedience to law, but to balance. 'Cause in the desert, greed was death. One person's excess could dry out a dozen gardens. This discipline wasn't imposed by kings or soldiers. It was cultural gravity. People understood that water was the one true equalizer, and that survival meant fairness. The Mocanis, too, had their own code. They worked in pairs or small groups, each responsible for a stretch of tunnel. They rarely spoke as they dug, relying on small knocks against the walls. 3 taps for safe, 2 for pause, 1 for trouble. When the lamps flickered, they'd lie flat, pressing their ears to the ground to listen for airflow. If they heard nothing, they'd dig sideways until they found a breath of wind, a sign the Qanat was still alive. It was exhausting work. The tunnels were barely shoulder wide, the air heavy with dust. They'd crawl for hours in silence, guided only by instinct and memory. Yet when they emerged, they carried themselves with quiet dignity. They knew they were part of something older than empire, a human covenant with the desert. Above ground, life followed the rhythm of the water. The city's daily routine was shaped by its flow. Bakers began kneading dough when the Qanat's cool water reached their quarter. Gardeners waited for their turn to flood the roots of pomegranate trees. Children played in the shaded alleys that curved around the underground channels. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the mountains, the people of Yazd gathered near the public cisterns, anbars, to fill their clay jars. Some of these cisterns were vast, domed chambers that could hold hundreds of thousands of liters. Steps descended into the earth, cool and echoing. At the bottom, the water shimmered in lantern light, perfectly still, perfectly cold. A single droplet falling from a ceiling crack might echo for seconds. It was a sound the people had heard for generations, a reminder that even in silence the earth was still breathing for them. But this fragile system required constant tending. When an earthquake struck, a Qanat could collapse in dozens of places. When heavy rain fell, rare but sudden, it could flood the tunnels. That's when the Mocanis became rescuers. They would descend immediately, shovels and ropes in hand, repairing by instinct what had been damaged by nature. To them, every meter of restored flow was a victory, not of strength, but of devotion. Over centuries, the same tunnels were reopened, reinforced, and redrawn, until the entire desert beneath Yazd resembled lace, a living architecture endlessly renewed. Even today, satellite images can trace the faint outlines of the old Qanat shafts, a dotted line stretching across the landscape like a stitched scar. Each dot marks the work of hands, sweat, and hope. Each marks a place where people reached into the earth and refused to surrender to thirst. Yet the desert remembers everything. The Mocanis say it holds the sound of every shovel strike, every whispered prayer. If you stand quietly enough on the plains outside Yazd at dusk, you might hear it, the faint rush of water far below, mingled with something softer, the breath of a world that learned long ago how to make peace with its limits. There is a certain hour in Yazd when time feels suspended. The sunlight glows honey gold on the mud brick walls, and a hush falls over the alleys. It's the same stillness that the Mocanis once felt deep underground, that moment before water breaks through rock, before life begins again. But now, the sound of picks and shovels has mostly vanished. The tunnels are quiet. The Qanat still run in some places, but many have gone dry, sealed, collapsed, or forgotten beneath asphalt and concrete. Modern pipes carry water now, drawn from faraway dams. The miracle has been replaced by machinery, and yet the old system still breathes quietly, stubbornly, beneath the surface. The last generation of Mocanis, men in their 60s and 70s, still walk the desert, tracing the invisible veins of the past. They can read the land like a book, a faint dip in the ground, a line of tamarisk trees, a subtle coolness in the wind. They know where water once flowed, even if the surface shows no sign of it. Their tools are the same as their ancestors: a pickaxe, a rope, a lamp, and a small leather pouch of dates. They speak softly when they work, not to each other but to the earth. They call the Qanats mother, because that's what she is. Every drop is her gift, every collapse her silence. One of these men, a master digger named Haj Qasim, was once asked why he still descended into the tunnels, even when few paid him to. He smiled and said, "When I go down there, I can hear my father's footsteps." It wasn't a metaphor. He meant it literally. The echo of past labor, still alive in the soil. For men like him, the Qanats are not relics of technology. They are sacred memory, a proof that human persistence can turn the impossible into routine. In the villages surrounding Yazd, the descendants of those engineers still live by the water they created centuries ago. Some gardens still bloom with pomegranate, mulberry, and fig trees, fed by the last trickles of Qanat water. Children still play near the domed cisterns, their laughter echoing where once the Makanis prayed before descending. Life, even in its quietest form, endures. But the people know the truth. The old balance is breaking. Where there was once cooperation, now there is competition. Electric pumps draw more than the desert can offer. The earth sinks, the wells dry, and the old tunnels collapse from neglect. In Yazd, a proverb circulates and older than memory. When the water forgets its path, the people forget each other. And yet, some still remember. In the early mornings before the heat rises, a few young engineers walk the outskirts of the city with notebooks and small drones. They study the old Qanat lines, mapping them with technology the ancients could never imagine. Their goal is not nostalgia, it's revival. They believe the Qanat system can return adapted for the modern age. Gravity-fed irrigation, passive cooling, sustainable water sharing. No pumps, no pollution, no waste. The old and the new side by side, like two mirrors reflecting the same wisdom across time. Sometimes they find a collapsed tunnel and send a camera inside. What the lens shows is haunting. A long corridor carved by hand, lined with stone still glistening with moisture. A few old tools lie rusted in the mud. A pickaxe, a pair of sandals, a clay lamp half buried in silt. The air inside is so still it feels like a breath held for centuries. When they restore one of these channels, even a few hundred meters of it, the water begins to flow again. Slowly at first, then steadily, as if remembering the way home. The first sound of water hitting sunlight after decades of silence and that soft trickle has moved engineers to tears. Above ground, the city remains the same labyrinth of ochre walls and wind towers. But the people who know where to listen can still hear what lies beneath. Not the roar of engines or the hum of pipes, but something subtler, older, more deliberate. The sound of endurance, because that's what Yazd truly is, not a city in the desert, but a conversation with it. Every brick, every tower, every drop of water is part of an ongoing reply to the question the desert keeps asking, "Will you survive me?" And the people for over 2,000 years have answered softly but surely, "Yes, we will." So when night falls and the air cools, the city seems to sigh. Lanterns flicker, the domes glow faintly, and beneath it all, somewhere deep below, the ancient channels hum with invisible life. Even the dry ones still remember what it was to carry water. The Makanis may fade, their tools may rust, but the idea, the quiet, mathematical beauty of guiding life through patience remains immortal. Because in Yazd, paradise was not a garden in the sky. It was a well-tended tunnel beneath your feet. If you walk through Shiraz at dawn, before the call to prayer echoes through the domes, you'll find the air thick with the scent of orange blossoms. The gardens, bags as the Persians called them, still hold the coolness of the night. Mist rises from the fountains, the marble paths glisten with dew, and somewhere beyond the cypress trees the faint outline of a pavilion waits in the soft light. It's quiet here but never empty, because in every Persian garden the idea of paradise is always present, not as a dream, but as a plan. The word paradise itself comes from the old Persian paradisa, meaning a walled enclosure. It was never meant to describe heaven as clouds and angels. It meant something more tangible, a space enclosed from chaos, shaped by human care, filled with water, shade, and balance. The people of ancient Persia believed that paradise could be built, not just imagined. They didn't seek escape from the world, they tried to perfect it. Every garden, no matter how grand or humble, followed a pattern called the Chahar Bagh, or 4 gardens. The layout was always the same. 4 quadrants divided by intersecting water channels, each representing one of the 4 rivers of heaven described in ancient texts: water, milk, honey, and wine. The center, where the channels met when was sacred. It was the point of harmony, the still heart of the world. The builders of Shiraz understood this geometry as both science and prayer. When they drew their first lines in the dust, they were drawing not just irrigation plans, but visions of cosmic order. They measured angles according to the stars, so that the flow of water would mirror the heavens. They planted cypress trees for eternity, pomegranates for fertility, roses for the soul, and jasmine for joy. Each plant had meaning. Each wall a purpose. Each step through the garden a metaphor for the soul's journey toward peace. At the height of the Safavid era, Shiraz was filled with such gardens, from royal estates to the quiet courtyards of scholars. The most famous among them was the Iram Garden, or Bagh-e Iram, meaning Garden of Paradise. It was designed not by a single architect, but by generations of hands, each adding a path, a tree, or a fountain, slowly building perfection over centuries. The garden still stands today, a museum of balance and calm. A long rectangular pool mirrors the sky. Rows of cypress trees march in perfect rhythm along the paths. At its center, a mansion rises, its facade decorated with blue tilework that glows like water under sunlight. But the real architecture is invisible. It's in the air, the sound, the rhythm. The entire space is designed to slow your breathing, to make you walk a little more carefully, to make you notice. The gardeners who tended these spaces weren't just laborers. They were philosophers with shovels. They learned to read the earth the way a poet reads silence. They mixed soils from different places, balanced pH with ashes and clay, and understood how to angle water so that it murmured softly without spilling. Each morning, before the nobles arrived, they'd sweep the gravel paths with palm branches, rearrange the pebbles along the fountains, and brush dust from the marble benches. They weren't working for wealth or fame. They were maintaining harmony. To them, cleanliness wasn't decoration. It was worship. And as the poets of Shiraz, Hafez, Sayati, and others, walked through these spaces, they saw their own art reflected in the symmetry around them. Hafez wrote of gardens where the wind carried divine secrets through the leaves. Sadi compared flowing water to the soul that seeks freedom but returns always to the source. The poets and the gardeners shared an understanding that order, patience, and beauty could heal the mind. That the act of tending to a tree, watering it, and shaping its shade was not so different from tending one's spirit. Visitors from far away, Greek historians, Arab travelers, and later European explorers, all described the gardens of Shiraz with disbelief. In the middle of arid plains, they found sanctuaries of green where birds sang, and the air was scented with roses. Many thought it sorcery. But to the Persians it was simply discipline. To build paradise, you needed not miracles but measurements. You needed patience, and most of all, you needed faith that beauty itself was a form of survival. In time, these gardens became more than places to rest. They became the stage upon which history unfolded, royal meetings, poetry readings, philosophical debates, and quiet funerals beneath the cypress shade. Every great Persian dynasty left behind its gardens as a signature, their philosophy rooted in stone and water. Even the conquerors who burned cities often spared the gardens, because they understood a garden is not merely decoration, it is memory itself, living, breathing, changing, and eternal. So tonight, as you imagine walking the long marble paths of Shiraz, under the glow of moonlight reflected in still water, think of the hands that built them. They were not chasing power or glory. They were measuring silence. They were designing peace. By midday, the city of Shiraz would shimmer like glass. The air trembled above the rooftops, and the scent of heat itself, dry stone and dust, filled the streets. But inside the garden walls, everything changed. The air was cooler, the light softer, filtered through branches heavy with fruit and flowers. The noise of the city faded behind thick mud brick walls. It was as if time slowed at the gate, yet the illusion of peace was built upon ceaseless work. Each garden, no matter how tranquil it appeared, was a living mechanism. The bag was an ecosystem, engineered to perfection long before the word engineering existed. The flow of water, the choice of trees, the height of walls, everything served a purpose. The gardeners, often born into their craft, knew the language of roots and shade better than they knew their own writing. They could touch a leaf and tell how long it had been since rain. They could dig into soil and know whether water ran too deep or too shallow beneath it. And every morning, long before dawn, they began the same ritual, awakening the garden. At first light, they swept the paths, not with brooms, but with bundles of reed tied together. They believed the reeds whispered to the ground, waking the spirits of the plants gently. Next came watering, the heart of the routine. The Qanat water, flowing quietly beneath the earth, was lifted through narrow stone channels into the pools. The system relied on gravity, not force. If the channels were perfectly angled, the water would glide like silk, silent, clear, unbroken. If the angle was even slightly wrong, it would stagnate or overflow. To correct this, gardeners used simple tools: a small reed, a pebble, a handful of clay. They would adjust the flow by instinct, guided by the reflection of sunlight on the rippling surface. It was a dance. One mistake and the garden could flood or dry overnight. The younger apprentices learned slowly. Old masters would test them. How long, they'd ask, does it take for sunlight to reach the bottom of this pool? The answer told them whether the water was clean enough or whether algae had begun to grow. The garden was both their classroom and their scripture. They believed water carried memory. If treated with respect, it remembered its path and kept flowing. If neglected, it grew restless and it would overflow, seep away, or vanish entirely. So the gardeners treated every channel, every basin, every droplet with quiet reverence. As the sun rose higher, the air filled with the sound of trimming, pruning, and soft footfalls on gravel. They clipped the cypress branches evenly, not to control nature, but to mirror it. A cypress tree in a Persian garden was a symbol of eternity, unbending evergreen. To shape it wrongly was almost an insult to time itself. Roses, on the other hand, demanded conversation. Each bush was treated differently, pruned according to its mood, watered according to its scent. Gardeners would murmur to them as they worked, believing the roses bloomed better for kind voices. The poet Sadi, who wrote in Shiraz centuries ago, once observed, "The scent of a rose stays in the hand that gives it." And in these gardens, that was more than poetry. It was practice. The scent clung to the workers' fingers, to their robes, even to the tools they used. When they rested at midday under the shade of fig trees, the smell of their own labor was sweet. The design of each garden also served the mind. The pathways were deliberately arranged to encourage reflection. Long, straight avenues for contemplation, curved side routes for wandering thought. At intersections, small fountains or resting benches waited, giving the visitor a choice: continue or pause. Every part of the garden invited decision, yet none demanded it. It was a philosophy of gentle freedom. Many Persians believed that a garden was a mirror of the soul. If the garden was balanced, so was its keeper. If the water ran unevenly, perhaps something in the heart needed tending. And so tending the earth became a kind of self-discipline, a dialogue between nature and the human spirit. In the evenings, when the nobles and poets arrived, the gardeners vanished quietly into the shadows. The guests saw only perfection, the water shimmering gold with sunset, the air cooled by scent and shade. They rarely thought about the men who had shaped every ripple, trimmed every leaf, but the gardeners didn't mind. They preferred to remain unseen, for they knew. True beauty is not in being noticed, but in creating calm. And sometimes late at night after the visitors left, the gardeners would sit by the pools alone. They'd listen to the sound of the water and watch the stars reflected in it, a perfect heaven on earth floating at their feet. The air smelled of orange blossoms and damp stone. The only light came from oil lamps flickering near the pavilion. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had built paradise, and for a brief moment they were inside it. But paradise, even one made of stone and water, is never permanent. Gardens require endless tending, and the balance of Shiraz between nature and man, between beauty and survival, was fragile. As kings rose and fell, as wars and droughts came, the fountains sometimes dried, the trees withered, and the walls cracked. Each time, a new generation had to begin again, sweeping, pruning, repairing, rebuilding. To keep paradise alive was not a single act, but a lifetime of small, repetitive mercies. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the Persian garden, that heaven is not a reward waiting beyond life. It's the patient maintenance of harmony, here now in the dust and sunlight of the world. By the time the last Qajar princes ruled Persia, the gardens of Shiraz were already fading into memory. The marble paths had cracked under dust. The pools lay shallow and weeds crept through the edges of old mosaics. Still, even in ruin, they were beautiful. Travelers from Europe wrote in their journals that Shiraz looks like the ghost of paradise. And in a way, they were right. The geometry remained, the cypress trees still reached toward the sun, but the heart, the water, had grown faint. The qanats that once whispered beneath the earth had slowed to silence. But even when the water stopped, the idea kept flowing. Every city keeps a secret rhythm, a pulse beneath its noise. For Shiraz, that rhythm was the sound of fountains. When it vanished, the people noticed. Poets began writing of loss not as tragedy, but as gentle acceptance, or the notion that beauty, like water, is meant to move on. One anonymous gardener wrote a small poem on a tile he left beside a broken pool. When the water forgets our names, the dust will still remember our hands. That single line became a proverb among the caretakers of old gardens. It meant that labor itself, the act of tending, shaping, repairing, was the true paradise, not the finished result. The journey mattered more than the bloom, yet not all was lost. During the 19th century, the great Aram garden was restored once more, not as a royal estate, but as a place of public peace. Scholars and students began to walk its paths again, and the fountain sang softly once more. When the University of Shiraz took charge of its care, the professors insisted the old symmetry remain untouched. Every brick replaced had to match the old pattern. Every cypress replanted had to follow the same alignment traced centuries before. It wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity. To alter the geometry would be to break a promise made by ancestors. That order and beauty could exist even in hardship. If you visit Aram today, or the smaller gardens like Naranjistan, Afifabad or Delgosha, you can still feel that old discipline. The same measured peace lingers in the air. Students read under the pavilions. Old men sip tea by the fountains, and children run through the reflected light that dances off the water. The past isn't gone. It's simply breathing slower. And above all of it, the poets remain. Their words have outlasted the walls. Hafez's tomb lies within a garden of its own, a final sanctuary of stone and blossoms. There, people come not to mourn but to rest. They recite his verses aloud, letting the sound ripple through the leaves like wind over water. I have learned that every rose must fade, but love remains the gardener. There is something strangely eternal about a Persian garden, even when it dies. Perhaps it's because the people who built it never saw it as mere decoration. To them, a garden was an argument against despair, a statement that life, no matter how harsh, could still be balanced, fragrant, and ordered. And so, even when droughts came, even when the walls crumbled, people would plant one more rosebush. Just one more chance to keep paradise alive. At night, when the moonlight rests on the pool surface, Shiraz still glows with the soft reflection of centuries. The stars above and their mirrored twins below meet perfectly in the still water, heaven and earth touching briefly. The sound of fountains is softer now, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not the rush of water, but the breath of memory. It says, "Paradise was never a place. It was an act." And the act continues, in every gardener who bends to prune a rose, in every poet who measures silence, in every person who pauses long enough to notice the peace of symmetry. Because in Shiraz, paradise isn't lost. It simply waits quietly, patiently, for hands willing to tend it again. It is said that when the traveler Jean Chardin first saw Isfahan in the 17th century, he stood speechless for an hour. Before him stretched a city unlike any in the world, a perfect pattern of avenues, domes, arches, and fountains, glowing under the desert sun like a piece of heaven that had fallen to earth. He wrote later, "Isfahan is half the world," and perhaps for a brief moment in history it truly was. Isfahan was not born from chance. It was drawn, measured, imagined, and executed with the precision of a celestial diagram. When Shah Abbas made it the capital of his empire around 1598, he summoned the finest builders, calligraphers, and mathematicians of Persia. Their mission was not simply to build a city, but to create a model of harmony, a reflection of divine order through human hands. The heart of this design was Nakshi Jahan Square, the image of the world. It stretched wide and calm, framed by arcades and crowned with two unmatched jewels: the Shah Mosque, its dome rising like a turquoise sun, and the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, a smaller, quieter masterpiece glowing like candlelight at dawn. But what most travelers never realized was this: the true architects of Isfahan were not the rulers or the priests. They were the mathematicians, engineers and masons who worked in near silence for decades, following equations that balanced beauty and faith. For them, architecture was not decoration. It was devotion made visible. Every line, curve, and angle carried meaning. The placement of the domes, the flow of the courtyards, even the way sound echoed beneath the arches, all were designed to imitate the perfection of the heavens. In Persian philosophy, beauty was a form of truth. To construct something symmetrical was not merely to please the eye. It was to imitate the order of the universe, and so every structure became a prayer written in geometry. The Shah Mosque, for instance, was oriented in a way that defied logic but achieved perfection. Naqshi Jahan Square faces north-south, but the mosque itself needed to face Mecca, southwest. So the architects designed an angled entrance that bent gently into the correct direction, like a bow of reverence. From outside, the transition is invisible. A trick of perspective, a quiet correction that keeps faith aligned with art. Inside, the echo is flawless. One whisper beneath the main dome can be heard clearly across the entire chamber. The architects calculated the curvature of the dome with such precision that the sound waves travel in perfect harmony. No distortion, no delay. They built not with amplifiers, but with intuition and patience. The tiles of Isfahan became their second language. Each was a mathematical equation rendered in color. The turquoise and lapis lazuli glazes were arranged in repeating star patterns, giri, whose geometry could extend infinitely without breaking rhythm. To look at them too long was to feel a kind of stillness, as if your eyes were listening to music. The artisans who made these tiles worked for months on a single panel. They ground minerals by hand, traced grids with charcoal, and measured with string and reed rulers. Each pattern had to align perfectly, or the illusion of infinity would break. To make a single mistake was to distort the order of the cosmos. And yet there is a small secret hidden in almost every great dome of Isfahan. One intentional flaw. A tiny asymmetry in the pattern, invisible to the untrained eye, placed there to acknowledge that only God is perfect. For the people who lived in the city, all of this order had a quiet effect. Isfahan didn't simply look beautiful, it felt peaceful. The streets were wide and shaded by plane trees. Water channels carried coolness from the Zayande River through gardens and courtyards. Pavilions opened toward the light, always offering a view of symmetry, sky mirrored in stone. And when the call to prayer echoed across the city, it seemed to come from every direction at once. The domes amplified it, the courtyards softened it, and the sound moved like wind, not commanding but inviting. Even those walking through the bazaar would pause, just for a heartbeat, feeling that the city itself was breathing. The builders of Isfahan rarely signed their names. Many were craftsmen from villages, educated only in the logic of balance and the patience of repetition. They mixed their own mortar, carved their own bricks, and whispered prayers as they worked. They believed that when a dome was completed, the sound of their hammer strikes became part of the structure's voice, forever echoing upward. To them, silence was not emptiness. It was structure. Every pause between notes, every shadow between tiles, every space between arches, all served a purpose. They were shaping the unseen, giving form to quiet. By the time Isfahan's great works were completed, the city had become something more than a capital. It was a living equation, a dialogue between human order and divine infinity. Visitors described feeling calm simply walking through it. They didn't need to understand the mathematics. Their hearts recognized the balance. And so, for centuries, Isfahan remained a city where stillness had meaning, where domes were prayers, where beauty was not entertainment but evidence. When the Safavid capital moved to Isfahan in 1598, a small group of men gathered in the shade of the Ali Kapu Palace courtyard. They were not nobles or soldiers. They carried no swords, wore no silk. Their tools were compasses, string, and parchment. Their leader, a man called Baha al-Din al-Amili, known simply as Sheikh Bahai, was both a theologian and a mathematician. He believed something radical, that the perfect city could bring a person closer to understanding God. Baha al-Din came from Lebanon originally, a scholar trained in astronomy, geometry, and religious law. When Shah Abbas invited him to Isfahan, he was given a strange mission, not only to advise on religious matters but to design the flow of the city itself. How should its streets breathe? Where should its water flow? How should its people move between work and prayer, noise and silence? To most rulers, such questions would have seemed irrelevant. But Abbas trusted Baha'i. He called him the architect of balance. The great project began not with palaces or mosques, but with water. In a city surrounded by desert, water was not merely a resource, it was grace made visible. Baha'i designed a network of underground channels, qanats, that carried cool, clear water from the Zayande River into gardens, fountains, and bathhouses. It was said that he could listen to the ground and tell where the earth would yield its sweetest flow. These channels were so cleverly hidden and sloped that the city's fountains all ran without a single pump. The water seemed to move by prayer alone, and so the people called it Baha'i's River. When it worked, the city thrived. When it dried, they said the city had lost its rhythm. Next, Baha'i turned his attention to the mosques, especially the smaller ones that few visitors ever saw. He was fascinated by how sound moved. In his notebooks he wrote, "To speak to God is easy. To hear him you must know where to stand." So he experimented. He would have apprentices recite verses of the Quran inside half-built domes, listening to how the sound curved and faded. He learned that if the curve of a dome was too steep, the echo became sharp and restless, like argument. If it was too shallow, the sound died too quickly, like fatigue. But if the curve followed the right ratio, the voice lingered, softened, and returned, as if the building itself was answering. That ratio, he discovered, matched the same mathematical proportions found in early Persian gardens. The Chaharbagh, the fourfold design symbolizing the rivers of paradise, geometry, water, and faith, all shared one pattern. Visitors often noticed the feeling of Isfahan before its appearance. The streets seemed to pull you forward, then slow you down. The buildings framed the sky just so. Even the breeze felt choreographed. This was Baha'i's hidden genius. He designed motion, not monuments. He believed that walking through the city should be like reading a poem. Long lines for reflection, short lines for rest. He once wrote to the Shah, "A city is a prayer you can walk through." Meanwhile, beneath the sound of chisels and hammers, mathematicians worked beside artisans in small lamplit rooms. They calculated the curvature of domes using string and dust. To mark perfect circles, they used nothing but nails, rope, and patience. Each circle was checked not by rulers, but by the sweep of sunlight at noon. In one surviving letter from a tilemaker to his apprentice, the older man scolds gently, "You measured the circle, but did you listen to it?" The phrase confused historians for years, until they realized what he meant. The artisans judged symmetry not only by sight, but by the way a whisper echoed under the dome. The geometry had to sound right. Then came the Sheikh Lutfola Mosque, the small radiant building that still glows like a lantern at the edge of Nakshi Jahan Square. It was built not for the public, but for the Shah's private prayers and his family. It has no minarets, no courtyard, and yet it is one of the most perfect domes in existence. From outside, the dome appears cream-colored. From inside, it turns to gold, then violet, then blue, depending on the hour of the day. At noon, when sunlight pours through the lattice windows, the walls bloom with light. Tiny bird shapes seem to rise and circle above the worshipper's head. This illusion was deliberate. Baha'i and his team placed each tile to catch a specific angle of sunlight, a slow shifting reminder that faith, too, changes with time. The people of Isfahan did not see these designs as luxuries. They were necessities, for peace of mind, for beauty, for faith. Even the simplest bazaar stall often had a small dome above it, so the sound of conversation would rise instead of echoing harshly. A prayer for calm, disguised as acoustics. The Masons left no written theories, but the city itself remains their textbook. Every arch, every tile, every whisper beneath a dome still teaches what they believed. that perfection does not shout. It hums quietly, endlessly, like water beneath the ground. By the end of his life, Sheikh Bahai's beard had turned white as dust. He lived simply, teaching students, often sitting beside fountains he had designed himself. He died without riches, but the city he shaped became his living monument. When his students asked him what he considered his greatest creation, he smiled and said, "The pause between footsteps. And if you walk through Isfahan at dusk, when the domes cool and the water reflects the last light, you might understand what he meant." The city seems to breathe between every echo, every shimmer, every silence. By the middle of the 18th century, Isfahan had grown quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of gardens and fountains, but the heavy kind, the silence that follows decline. The river still flowed, the dome still shone in the sun, but the air felt thinner, as if the city itself were tired. The dynasty that built it, the Safavids, had fallen. Trade had slowed. The marble courtyards began to fill with dust. But even in its fading, Isfahan remained graceful, a city whose design was too perfect to die quickly. Travelers who arrived during those years noticed something haunting. They said that when they walked through the Naqsh-e-Jahan Square at dawn, they could still hear faint echoes under the arches. The call to prayer would rise from the Shah Mosque, drift across the bazaar, and return as if the city itself were whispering a reply. It was not imagination. The architects had designed those echoes to last forever, a dialogue between stone and sound, long after the voices were gone. In the old archives of Isfahan, there is a letter written by an unknown calligrapher to his son. It was found in the pages of a Quran manuscript preserved in the Lotfola Mosque library. It reads, "My son, we once believed that beauty would save us. Now I see that beauty cannot stop the world from changing, but it can remind us that change too has a pattern." That letter might have been written by anyone, a craftsman, an apprentice, or even one of Bahai's last students. But its sentiment captures the quiet philosophy that had built Isfahan, the belief that even in decay, symmetry remains. By the late 1700s, parts of the city had fallen into disrepair. Pigeons nested beneath the tiles of the great domes. The fountains dried. The markets thinned. And yet, the geometry still worked. When the morning sun hit the Shah Mosque, its reflection still landed perfectly across the square. The angled entrance still aligned flawlessly with Mecca. The pattern still sang in blue and gold, though chipped and faded. It was as though the city itself refused to forget its design. In those years, mystics and poets began to wander through the ruins, reading the buildings as if they were holy texts. They found meaning in every imperfection, a missing tile, a crooked arch, a shadow that fell differently each season. They called Isfahan the mirror of loss. One Sufi poet, standing under the crumbling dome of a caravanserai, wrote, "When the world forgets its order, remember the pattern of Isfahan, for even broken symmetry is a kind of prayer." Some of the craftsmen who had built the great city had descendants who stayed behind. They became caretakers, quietly maintaining the mosques, polishing tiles, sweeping dust from inscriptions no one could read anymore. They did not rebuild. They simply preserved, the way a gardener tends to a winter garden, knowing the flowers may never return. One of these caretakers was a mason named Hassan, whose family had once carved domes under Sheikh Bahai. He lived in a small room behind the Lotfola Mosque, waking each morning before sunrise to clean the courtyard. He said he did not do it for faith or fame. He did it because when the first light touched the dome, the city remembered itself. During the Qajar period, When new rulers built palaces in Tehran and the world began to modernize, Isfahan's perfection became an inconvenience. Its geometry no longer matched the ambitions of the age. Traders preferred railroads to rivers, soldiers preferred straight roads to gardens, and the old domes became relics of another rhythm. And yet, those who visited could not escape the feeling that they were walking through a dream. French painters tried to capture its symmetry. British officers wrote of its melancholy beauty. Persian poets still called it the sleep of paradise. The silence of Isfahan became its new identity. No longer a city of empire, but a city of memory. Today, when you stand beneath the Shah Mosque's great dome, you can still hear it, that whispering echo. Tourists call it an acoustic trick, but it is more than that. It is the voice of the builders, still looping through the air, defying time. Every sound that rises there joins the same current of resonance that has moved, unbroken, since the 1600s. It is perhaps the purest metaphor for what the architects believed, that true creation never ends, it only changes form. If you walk out into the square at night when the lanterns glow faintly and the fountains are still, you'll see the reflection of the domes in the water, perfect, unmoving, like stars trapped on earth. And if you wait long enough, a small ripple will distort that image, just enough to remind you that nothing perfect can stay still forever. Perhaps that was the lesson the silent architects meant to leave behind. That perfection is not a state, but a movement, a rhythm between sound and silence, symmetry and imperfection, heaven and earth. And so, Isfahan remains, a city that still whispers mathematics, still breathes geometry, still hums the faint note of devotion through its blue-tiled domes. The paradise it once mirrored may have faded, but the echo continues, unbroken, eternal, gentle. If Isfahan was a garden of paradise, then Yazd was its opposite, a city that survived where no garden should exist. Rising from the central desert of Iran, Yazd is a place of extremes, summers that scorch, winters that chill, and air so dry that it can turn brick to powder. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, people not only lived here, they thrived. Their secret was not conquest or wealth. It was engineering. Quiet, patient, invisible engineering. The traveler Marco Polo, who passed through Yazd in the 13th century, described it simply, a good and noble city built of earth, with excellent craftsmen and beautiful silken goods, but he never saw what lay beneath the surface and above it. For Yazd was not a city of chance. It was an invention. Every home, street, and wall was designed to work with the desert, not against it. And its most astonishing feature was something so subtle that even the wind itself became an architect. They were called bad gears, wind catchers. Imagine standing on a flat rooftop under the burning sun. The desert air wavers, dry as stone, and yet beneath you, in the cool rooms of the house, a breeze moves gently, as though someone invisible were fanning the walls. This miracle is the work of the Badgir, a tall, narrow tower rising from the roof, divided into 4 open shafts. When the wind blows, even faintly, it enters these openings, slides downward through the shaft, and cools as it mixes with air rising from underground water channels, the qanats. The result, rooms cooled without a single machine, centuries before electricity. Each badger was built according to careful mathematics, the height, width, and direction calculated precisely to match the wind patterns of that neighborhood. To build one wrong could mean suffocating heat. To build one right meant comfort even in 50-degree sea weather. The master builders of Yazd were called mimars, and their apprentices learned not from books, but from standing in the desert and listening. They would sprinkle sand in the air to study how the wind moved. They would trace the shadow of a wall across a single day, noting where it lingered longest. Only after that would they begin to draw. A saying among them went, "The wind does not speak twice. You must understand it the first time." Their architecture was not decoration, it was survival poetry. But the wind catchers were only half the secret. Below the city ran a hidden labyrinth of qanats, underground aqueducts that carried water from distant mountains into the heart of the city. They stretched for kilometers, sometimes through pure stone. Dug by hand, inch by inch, these tunnels were narrow enough for only one person to crawl through at a time. The men who dug them were called mukanis. They were paid little, prayed often, and risked their lives daily. A single collapse could bury them alive in silence and sand. Yet they continued, guided only by instinct, stars, and the faint trickle of moisture in the soil. Their tools were primitive: pickaxes, oil lamps, and rope. But their precision was astonishing. The slope of a qanat had to be perfect, falling no more than 1 meter per kilometer. Too steep, and the water would erode the tunnel. Too shallow, and it would never reach the city. Even today, satellite imagery shows some qanats running perfectly straight for over 50 kilometers. Lines of human persistence carved into the bones of the earth. To protect this water, the people of Yazd developed another invention: ab-anbars. Massive underground cisterns with domed roofs and spiral staircases. They stored cool water for months, kept pure by air circulation from, yes, the badgirs above them. Some cisterns were so large that their echo could be heard for several seconds, a low hum beneath the city. Standing inside, one feels like being inside a living lung. Cool air flows, drops of water fall softly, and the silence feels thick, the sound of breath itself. Life in Yazd followed the rhythm of its inventions. People rose before dawn, worked in shaded courtyards through the morning, and retreated to basements called sardabs during the afternoon heat. At night they slept on rooftops beneath stars so bright they seemed carved into the sky. Every movement, every routine, was shaped by the dialogue between heat and coolness, light and shade. Children grew up learning to recognize wind directions the way city children today learn street names. They could tell by the scent of the air whether rain had fallen far away, or whether a sandstorm was coming. The city was not built against nature, and it was built with it. Over centuries, Yazd became a sanctuary for merchants, travelers, and later for religion itself. When wars raged across Persia, Yazd remained untouched, protected by its remoteness and its calm. Zoroastrians, Muslims, and later Baha'is lived here side by side, bound by the same rule of desert life. Everything depends on balance. Its skyline became a forest of wind catchers, tall, pale, silent towers that looked almost like sails on a still sea. At sunset, when the light hit them just right, they glowed amber and gold, as if the desert itself had learned to breathe. Centuries later, when the first Europeans saw Yazd, they called it primitive air conditioning. But for the people who built it, the Badgir was not technology. It was philosophy. To them, the tower symbolized humility, a reminder that survival comes not from power, but from harmony. They often said, "The wind belongs to no one, so we borrow it gently." And so, under the vast silence of the Iranian desert, an entire civilization learned how to breathe with the wind, without fire, without fuel, without noise. Every whisper of air through those towers was a hymn to patience. Every drop of cool water from the qanats was a prayer answered by human hands. The city still stands, its towers still turning the wind into comfort. proof that the most enduring technology may also be the quietest. Long before anyone saw Yazd's famous wind towers, before its graceful mosques and domed cisterns, there were tunnels, invisible rivers carved by hand beneath the desert floor. They were the qanats, and the men who built them were called muqanis, the diggers of veins. Their work was not glorious. It began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. They carried no banners, wore no armor, and left behind no monuments. And yet, they created something that outlived empires, a system that turned lifeless ground into living earth. Each qanat began at a mountain, where snowmelt seeped deep into rock. The muqanis would find that hidden water, not by instruments, but by instinct. They would taste the soil, watch the color of the stones, listen for the faintest sound of moisture. Some claimed to smell water from miles away. Once they located a source, they began to dig. A narrow vertical shaft first, then another, until a line of holes marked their path across the desert like the spine of a buried dragon. Then they would connect these shafts with a horizontal tunnel, gently sloping down toward the city. Every few meters they would stop to check their work, measuring the angle with simple tools, a string, a drop of water, and patience. The entire slope of a qanat might change by less than a man's thumb over hundreds of meters. A single misjudgment could mean disaster. Inside the tunnel, the air was suffocating. The men worked by the light of oil lamps that burned so dimly they barely showed their own hands. The sound of picks against rock echoed endlessly, like a pulse in the dark. Sometimes the roof would crack. Sometimes the air would run out. Sometimes they simply disappeared, entombed in the very veins they had carved. The people of Yazd spoke of them with reverence. When a new qanat reached the city, there would be quiet celebration. Children would gather at the opening, waiting for the first drop of cold water to emerge. The muqanis would not speak. They would bow their heads and let the water flow. For them, it was not a triumph of human mastery. It was permission granted by the earth. Over time, entire families became known for their expertise. The Farahani, Rashidi, and Yusufi clans, each with their own secret methods. They passed their craft down through generations, father to son, teacher to apprentice. A young muqani would begin by carrying tools, then by clearing debris. And only after years of observation would he be allowed to strike the first blow of a new tunnel. In their code of ethics, recorded in fragments of Old Persian and Arabic, there were rules that sound almost like prayers. Do not dig in anger. Do not rush the slope. The earth listens. Be patient. These were not metaphors. In the tunnels, impatience could kill. A single careless blow could trigger collapse. So every movement, every breath, had to follow rhythm. Steady, precise, calm. Above ground, life in Yazd pulsed in time with the work below. As the muqanis dug deeper, water appeared in the cisterns. When they rested, the city waited in thirst. It was said that every drop of water that reached a Yazdi courtyard carried with it the heartbeat of the men beneath the earth. In the cool evenings, when families gathered for tea, elders would tell stories of the unseen workers, men who dug so far they could hear the mountain breathe, men who could feel the temperature of rock through their palms, men who whispered Bismillah before every swing of the pickaxe. And though their faces were rarely known, their work was sacred. In Yazd's oldest cemetery, some graves bear no name, only the symbol of a pick and a drop of water. Those are the resting places of the muqanis. The qanats they built were more than just tunnels. They were social systems. Each one was owned collectively, and its water carefully measured and distributed. To take more than your share was not just theft, it was sin. The city had water clocks, called Sa'at-Iyab, to divide the flow into equal hours. Each family's share was measured not by volume, but by time. For example, one house might have 2 hours of water every third day. When their time came, they opened their channel gate. When it ended, they closed it, even if their pots were not yet full. No guards were needed, no one cheated, because everyone understood the same truth. In the desert, greed is death. As centuries passed, the Qanats multiplied, more than 50,000 across Iran, thousands beneath Yazd alone. Some still run today, cool and silent. Modern engineers have studied them and marveled. How could such precision achieved with no machines remain functional for over a millennium? The answer lies not in tools, but in temperament. The Muqanis built for eternity. They worked with a patience that modern time no longer knows. A master Muqani once said, "We do not dig tunnels. We draw lines between yesterday and tomorrow." And indeed, every Qanat was a thread connecting generations, a silent agreement between the living and the dead. By the 19th century, when foreign engineers began introducing pumps and pipes, many believed the old systems would disappear. But Yazd's elders resisted. They said machines were too loud. They would frighten the water. And perhaps they were right. Many modern wells collapsed or dried, while the ancient Qanat still flowed gently beneath. Today, some of these tunnels have become tourist sites, lit by electric bulbs, paved for safety. But deep in the desert, a few still function as they always have. Water whispering through dark stone, guided by hands that left no names. Above ground, the wind towers continue their quiet dialogue with the air, and below the Qanats still hum their low song, a music of gravity, slope, and faith. Together, they form the breath and heartbeat of Yazd, a city that learned to live not by conquering the desert, but by listening to it. By the time the 20th century arrived, the desert city of Yazd had already endured 1,000 years of heat and hardship. To the untrained eye, it looked fragile, a scatter of mud brick houses, minarets leaning under the weight of centuries, streets so narrow that even sunlight had to twist and bend to pass through. And yet, it survived when greater cities, Persepolis, Ctesiphon, even parts of Shiraz, had faded into ruin. The secret of Yazd was never in its wealth or armies. It was in the invisible threads that tied its people to the land, a balance between human need and natural restraint. The Persians had a word for this balance, ta'adul. It meant harmony, proportion, and humility before nature. The desert engineers of Yazd had lived by this word for centuries. They believed that the desert was not an enemy to be conquered, but a teacher to be obeyed. Every wind tower, every water tunnel, every shaded street was a lesson written in clay. By day, the city shimmered under the sun. Dust hung in the air like silk. And yet, if you stepped inside a Yazdi home, the air was cool, dry, and strangely still. The tall wind catchers, baggirs, worked without noise or effort. They were silent lungs, drawing the faintest breezes from the desert and pushing them gently downward through a network of chambers and pools. It was said that the architects of Yazd learned their craft by studying birds. They noticed how vultures circled above the dunes, how air rose from heated rock, how shadows lengthened with time. Then they shaped their city to follow those same patterns. Where other cities fought against the sun, Yazd danced with it. At the center of Yazd stood the Amir Chakmak complex, its symmetrical facade like a woven carpet of arches. By evening it glowed golden with light, not the bright, aggressive light of electricity, but the soft shimmer of oil lamps. In those hours when the desert cooled, the people of Yazd would gather beneath its shade to trade stories. Farmers spoke of water shares, merchants of silk roots, priests of the eternal flame that burned in the Zoroastrian temple nearby. And always above their voices, the wind whispered through the towers, a language only the city could understand. Even the religion of Yazd adapted to the desert's rhythm. The ancient Zoroastrians who once ruled the Persian Empire had long worshipped fire and light. In Yazd, their flame temples were small and enclosed, their fires modest and steady. It was said that if the fire flickered too violently, it meant disrespect to the desert, a sign that humans were trying too hard to shine. When Islam came, the city absorbed it like it absorbed everything else, slowly, patiently, and without losing its character. The mosques of Yazd followed the same logic as the qanats and wind towers, grace through restraint. The Friday Mosque of Yazd, with its tall portal tiled in blue and turquoise, seemed to rise not from ambition, but from quiet devotion. Every detail, the height of the arches, the slope of the courtyard, even the thickness of the wall, was designed for balance, for calm, for survival. To live in Yazd was to learn a different kind of time. There were no seasons of abundance. The desert offered only two gifts, endurance and clarity. Children learned from elders when to open the water gates, when to seal the roofs with new clay, when to rest from work. The city moved not by the clock but by the temperature of air and the taste of dust. Travelers often called it boring. No grand spectacles, no wars, no lavish banquets, just endless days of quiet labor, water measurement, and wind adjustment. And yet those boring routines were what allowed Yazd to endure. Where other cities exhausted their soil and rivers, Yazd thrived on scarcity. In the 1930s, when the first motorized wells arrived, people rejoiced. Finally, water could be pumped directly without the slow patience of the qanats. But within a generation, the underground tunnels began to collapse. The balance that had held for centuries started to tremble. Elders warned, if you pull water too fast, the desert will take back what it gave. They were right. By the end of the century, several qanats dried up. The air grew hotter. The soil turned salt white. It was as if the land itself mourned the silence of the old Mukhanis. And yet even now, when you walk through Yazd at night, you can feel the old wisdom breathing beneath your feet. The wind towers still sigh softly. The old cisterns still echo with the sound of dripping water. The people still rise before dawn to sweep their rooftops and whisper Bismillah before drawing water from the wells. If you stand in the old quarter, where the alleys twist like dried riverbeds, you might find a faint chill brushing your face, a breath from a forgotten qanat far below. It feels like the desert exhaling. It feels like time remembering itself. The Persian gardeners who designed paradise above ground also shaped it below. Their gardens were not only made of trees and flowers, but of patience, geometry, and gratitude. The same spirit that made the gardens of Shiraz bloom also kept Yazd alive. Paradise, it turns out, is not a place of abundance. It is a place where humans learn to take just enough, and to thank the earth for giving it. Yazd, the city that breathes with the wind, stands as a quiet monument to that idea. A reminder that true endurance is not loud, not proud, not even visible. It hums beneath the surface like cool water under sand. And perhaps somewhere deep below, a tunnel still carries the same water that once touched the hands of a Mukhani centuries ago. Perhaps he still walks those passages in spirit, listening, measuring, waiting. And maybe if you listen closely enough to the whisper of the wind over Yazd's rooftops, you'll hear the old greeting echo softly through the centuries. Peace upon the diggers of the veins. Peace upon the keepers of balance. Peace upon the desert that remembers. Centuries ago, when the empire of Persia stretched from Anatolia to the Indus, its gardens were not mere ornaments. They were philosophies made visible. They represented balance, control, and the fragile contract between humankind and the natural world. But empires fall, dynasties crumble, and sometimes ideas must travel to survive. The Persian garden, paradisa, the walled enclosure from which we get the word paradise, did not vanish with the fall of the Achaemenids or the Sasanians. It drifted outward, carried by merchants, scholars, and exiles. Each time it crossed a border, it changed shape, but never lost its essence. This is the story of how paradise learned to travel. The first journeys began quietly, with the defeat of Darius and Xerxes by Alexander. When the Macedonian armies entered Persia, they were astonished. They found gardens unlike any they had ever seen. Quadrants divided by flowing water, trees placed with mathematical precision, pathways aligned to the stars. Aristotle's students wrote of them as ordered nature, an idea so strange and beautiful that it followed Greek thought for generations. But when Alexander left, he took more than gold. He took gardeners. A small group of Persian caretakers were brought westward, tasked with tending the new royal gardens in Babylon, then in Greece itself. There, surrounded by dry olive groves and marble courtyards, they began to plant their vision anew, fruit trees in symmetrical rows, narrow canals tracing perfect lines. Locals called them the Eastern plots, dismissing them as foreign curiosities. But slowly the idea spread. To walk among water and shade in the heat of noon was a kind of quiet wealth that needed no translation. When the Islamic world rose centuries later, it inherited Persia's engineers, artists, and poets. The caliphs of Damascus and Baghdad invited Persian scholars to design their palaces. And with them came the geometry of paradise. In the Umayyad desert palaces, the courtyards bloomed with pomegranate and jasmine. In Baghdad's round city, streams curved like verses of the Quran, flowing toward the caliph's palace at the center. Even the language absorbed the garden's rhythm. The Quran described heaven as a garden beneath which rivers flow, echoing the ancient Persian metaphor almost word for word. But not all who carried the tradition did so in triumph. Some carried it in exile. When Mongol and Turkic invasions swept across Persia in the 13th century, scholars and gardeners fled. Many found refuge in India. Among them were families who had once tended royal gardens in Shiraz and Isfahan. They arrived with little more than tools, seeds, and a memory of proportion. In India, they met a new kind of abundance: monsoon rains, fertile soil, and endless green. Here, the Persian sense of restraint met the subcontinent's wild generosity. The result was something entirely new: the Mughal garden. Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty and descendant of Timur, wrote in his memoirs, "The land of Hind is beautiful, but it lacks order. I shall make it a garden." He ordered his architects to design charbas, fourfold gardens inspired by Persian layouts, wherever he settled. Streams were diverted into perfect quadrants, terraces cut into hills, and each section planted with trees that symbolized the seasons of life. Under his descendants, Humayun, Akbar Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, these gardens became living philosophies. The Taj Mahal itself, though known as a tomb, is also a garden, a precise paradise of symmetry and reflection. Its channels mirror the stars. Its cypress trees represent eternity. Its fruit trees, renewal. But perhaps the most poignant of all the travelers of paradise were those who never returned. The gardeners who settled in foreign lands often changed their names, blending into new cultures. In Spain, after the fall of Persia and the spread of Islamic art, Andalusian courtyards began to mirror the Paradisa. The Alhambra of Granada, with its reflecting pools and whispering fountains, still carries the same soul, the balance of stone and water, shadow and light. Even when the Persians were long gone, their geometry remained. The sound of water in a tiled channel, the play of sunlight on orange blossoms, these were their signatures, left behind in every corner of the old world. The garden had become a traveler, just as much as the merchants who crossed deserts or the scholars who copied manuscripts. And in each new home it adapted. In Spain it spoke Arabic. In India it sang in Urdu. In the Ottoman lands it took on the scent of tulips. And in every tongue it still whispered the same message. Paradise is not found, and it is built. Yet behind all this beauty was a story of loss. The original gardens of Persia, the ones that inspired it all, slowly faded. Droughts, invasions, and neglect claimed them one by one. The names of their keepers were forgotten. Their canals filled with sand. All that remained were poems, verses of Hafez, Saadi, and Rumi describing places that no longer existed. Still, the idea persisted. Even in ruin, it remained alive in the mind. One traveler, writing in the 17th century after visiting the ruins of Pasargadae, where Cyrus the Great once walked, wrote, "The garden is gone, but the air remembers it." He described standing among broken channels and dried roots, yet feeling an inexplicable calm, as if the symmetry still lingered in the silence. It was as though paradise had been absorbed into the soil itself, waiting to bloom again whenever human hands remembered how to shape it. So tonight, as we drift through time and dust, imagine this: a gardener from Shiraz exiled to Delhi, planting cypress trees by moonlight, a craftsman from Isfahan tracing geometric tiles in Granada, a nameless laborer in Yaz listening to the whisper of a qanat, knowing that somewhere water is still flowing, all of them in their quiet ways, tending the same dream, a world where chaos could be calmed, where beauty could outlast empires. The Garden of Paradise was never just about shade and water. It was about memory, about creating peace where there was none, about refusing to let the world remain wild and cruel. Even when it crossed the seas, the garden carried its secret. To build paradise, you must begin with patience. And perhaps that is why, after thousands of years, its spirit still grows. When the Mughals came to power in India, the Persian garden found a new climate and a new purpose. In Persia, the garden had been an oasis in the desert, a measured defiance against dryness. But in India, where rivers overflowed and trees grew without invitation, the same geometry became a way to discipline abundance. Babur, the empire's founder, often wrote of homesickness. He missed the cool valleys of Samarkand, the crisp scent of Cyprus, the thin, high air of Central Asia. His Indian gardens were not only for pleasure, they were medicine for longing. He built them in Kabul first, then in Agra, as if to carry his lost homeland with him. He wrote in his memoirs, the Baburnama, "In the heat and dust of Hindustan, I sought a place where memory could breathe." And so he drew lines on paper, fourfold, perfect, balanced, and the charba once again reborn. Each part of the garden mirrored a stage of life, each channel a river from heaven, but this time the rivers were real, drawn from the Yamuna, from the Ganges, from canals that glittered like silver veins across the plains. As the Mughal dynasty expanded, the Persian gardeners who had arrived as humble exiles became royal engineers. They were given honorific titles: Bagban Miribag, keeper of the Paradise Quadrant. Their descendants still carried those surnames generations later, even after the empire crumbled. In the humid air of Delhi, Agra, and Lahore, the original Persian geometry softened. Mango trees replaced pomegranates. Bananas and jasmine crept into the once rigid symmetry. The birds changed, the perfumes thickened, but the idea remained. Each morning, the royal gardeners began their work not with commands but with a prayer. Grant us balance between water and dust. And in that prayer lay the heart of centuries of Persian wisdom. When Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal, it was not simply as a tomb for his queen. It was as a continuation of that prayer. Every tree, every channel, every reflection pool was calculated to ease sorrow into stillness. The central waterway running from the gate to the tomb symbolized the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path to peace. The sound of trickling fountains was meant to imitate the verses of the Quran being recited in rhythm. It is said that Shah Jahan would sometimes sit by the water at night, watching the moon float in its mirrored surface and whisper to himself, "Paradise was never meant to be reached, only remembered." But as empires rise, so too do they decay. By the late 18th century, the Mughal gardens began to wilt under neglect. The British colonists who arrived in India saw them as curiosities and pretty, but impractical. They built lawns instead, large and empty, trimmed to uniform green. The canals were filled, the fountains silenced. The Persian sense of balance was replaced by European order. To the British eye, a garden was something to be displayed, not inhabited. The geometry remained, but the soul grew faint. And yet, even under colonial rule, a few old gardeners kept their faith. In the fading light of evening, they would water small patches of soil in forgotten corners of Delhi's ruins. They would hum old Persian verses under their breath, poems of Rumi and Hafez that their ancestors had brought across mountains. To them, tending the soil was resistance. It was remembrance. One English officer once wrote of seeing an old man in Lahore crouched by a broken fountain, whispering softly as he planted jasmine cuttings. When asked what he was doing, the man replied, "Restoring what was promised." Far beyond India, the same story unfolded again and again. In Andalusia, Muslim gardeners kept their craft alive under Christian rule. In Central Asia, descendants of Persian engineers dug new qanats, naming them after their lost cities, Isfahan, Kerman, Yazd. Even in Ottoman Istanbul, the concept of the Paradisa guided palace architects, from the Topkapi courtyards to the tulip beds of the Bosphorus. Everywhere the garden traveled, it carried the same paradox. It was both a memory and a prophecy. It remembered a past of harmony, and it foretold a world that might one day remember it again. But there was one place where paradise found its strangest form, far from the east across the sea. When the first Persian seeds reached Europe through trade and conquest, they were misunderstood. The French and English believed they were copying Mughal and Moorish aesthetics, but what they were truly inheriting was the world's oldest conversation between humans and the land. The Jardin Persian became the model for many later designs, from the Versailles reflecting pools to the Spanish patio gardens, even as colonizers took what they did not fully understand. The spirit of the design, its longing for symmetry, its reverence for water, never left them. The garden, once a symbol of empire, became a quiet teacher again. In the early 19th century, a Persian poet named Mirza Abul Hassan Khan visited England as part of a diplomatic mission. He walked the royal gardens at Kew and wrote in his diary, "The English have built paradise, but they do not sit in it. They walk quickly, as if afraid of stillness." He saw in their restlessness the greatest difference between his homeland and theirs. For Persians, a garden was a place to pause, to breathe, to listen. For Europeans, it was something to admire, then leave. It was perhaps the fate of paradise in exile, to be seen, but not felt, even now, centuries later. Traces of that philosophy survive. In the courtyards of Iranian homes where water still ripples under the moonlight. In the Mughal ruins where children play among cypress trees. In the Spanish patios where oranges bloom in winter. Each of these spaces, whether grand or humble, still carries the same quiet lesson. Paradise is not a place. It is a way of arranging the world so that peace becomes possible. And those who keep it alive, and the gardeners, architects, and storytellers, are all, in their way, the gardeners of exile. Tending to memories the world has almost forgotten. So, as we trace this long migration, from Pasargadae to Granada, from Shiraz to Delhi, from Yazd to the far edges of the sea, we realize that paradise never belonged to a single empire. It belonged to the patient, the observant, the humble, to those who could look upon dust and imagine water, who could feel heat and dream of shade. And in every age, such people have existed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Persian garden had scattered across continents like seeds on the wind. Some had taken root in palaces, others in abandoned courtyards. Many had disappeared entirely, buried beneath modern cities and forgotten wars. But a few remained, not as monuments but as living things, quietly breathing the old rhythm of balance and patience. The men and women who kept them alive were not nobles or architects. They were caretakers and the quiet, unremarkable souls who watered what others ignored. They did not write or build or rule. They remembered. In the Iranian plateau, where Yazd still stands like a faded sun between mountains and sand, the Bagbands, gardeners, begin work before dawn. They sweep the dry dust from tiled pools, unclog the ancient water channels, and whisper Bismillah before turning the first stream of water into the soil. Most of them cannot name the kings who once ruled their lands, but they know which tree blooms in the third month after rain. They know how to tilt a shovel so that water splits evenly between two saplings. They know that if the cypress grows crooked, the world feels slightly off balance. They do not tend gardens, they tend equilibrium. In a small town near Shiraz, one such gardener, an old man named Haj Karim, became a local legend not for wealth or invention but for his stubborn devotion. For 40 years he maintained the same enclosed orchard, long after its owners had fled the city. The well was shallow, the channels cracked, the walls leaned. Yet every evening a faint scent of orange blossoms floated from within. A traveler once asked him, "Why do you keep this garden alive when no one visits it?" He smiled and said, "Because it listens. A dead city still deserves to breathe." And in that answer lay the heart of all Persian gardening philosophy. That nature, once harmonized, is an act of worship. As industrial life crept across the old world, many of these principles began to fade. Cities grew loud, impatient, and bright. Concrete replaced clay. Rivers were diverted for factories. Qanats filled with debris. The wind towers of Yazd no longer whispered. They stood mute against the smog. Yet in the early 1970s, a quiet revival began. Architects, poets, and historians returned to study the old blueprints of paradise. They found that the geometry of ancient Persian gardens was not merely aesthetic, it was ecological. The walls trapped cool air. The trees filtered dust. The channels balanced humidity. It was a system, self-regulating, sustainable, elegant. The same system that had made deserts bloom for millennia. Suddenly, the boring details of history began to look like the instructions for the future. One architect from Tehran, Laleh Bakhtiar, wrote, "The Persian garden teaches that beauty is not a luxury, it is a form of survival." Her designs revived the old layouts: fourfold symmetry, central pools, shaded corridors. But she replaced marble with clay, fountains with recycled water, pomegranates with local shrubs. Her goal was not nostalgia, but renewal. In one interview, she said softly. Every city must find its garden, or it will lose its soul. Meanwhile, far across the seas in Granada, Spain, a historian named Rafael Torres began restoring the gardens of the Alhambra. He discovered Persian irrigation patterns hidden beneath layers of European reconstruction. When he reopened the channels, the old water routes flowed again, one for the first time in 400 years. Visitors spoke of hearing a strange echo in the courtyards, as if the earth was sighing with relief. Torres later wrote in his journal, "The Persians did not build gardens for kings. They built them for the planet." And still in the small villages of Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, the old Bagbans continue their quiet rituals. They prune the vines, repair the channels, replace cracked tiles. Their work is not recorded, their names unknown. But in their hands, paradise remains alive, and now not as legend, but as daily practice. Every spring, when the first bud appears on a pomegranate branch, an old proverb is whispered across the region. Paradise begins with one green leaf. It is not a metaphor. It is a rule of life. Even in exile, the Persian gardeners never truly lost their home. Wherever they planted, in Delhi, Damascus, Granada, or Yazd, they carried with them the same invisible blueprint: symmetry, water, patience, and faith. Those four principles became their compass. Through war, drought, and displacement, they kept building quiet order within chaos. Every courtyard, every canal, every shade tree was a statement that civilization begins wherever someone decides to care. Today, many of those gardens are tourist sites. Visitors walk quickly through them, snapping photos, speaking loudly. But if you stand still, perfectly still, you might feel what the old gardeners felt. The slow rhythm of water beneath the earth, the measured heartbeat of the world returning to calm. The ancient Persians called this Aramgah, the place of repose. Not paradise as escape, but as stillness restored. And so the story of paradise, like the story of Yazd, never really ends. It loops back quietly, endlessly, from the hands that dug the first kanet, to the hands that now plant saplings in dried soil, to yours perhaps listening tonight, imagining what it might mean to tend something gently, patiently, until it becomes beautiful. Because the truth whispered by every Persian gardener, every exile, every keeper of balance is this: paradise is not lost. It only waits for someone to remember how to water it. And so tonight's quiet journey comes to an end. The gardens fade into moonlight, the water slows, and the world grows still again. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. And remember, history is never truly gone. It simply rests waiting for us to listen. Good night, and thank you for wandering through sleepy, boring history.